The auctioneer's voice carried across the yard at 9:30 on a cold Tuesday morning in November of 1931, calling out numbers in that flat, professional cadence that made ruin sound like arithmetic. Annie Oakley stood at the fence line of the Mosey Butler property outside Darke County, Ohio, and listened to a man she had never met place a dollar value on the last 11 head of cattle she owned in the world. She was 71 years old, and she was dressed in her good wool coat, the dark green one Frank had always admired, because she had decided sometime in the night that she would not let this happen in a house dress. She stood very still. That composure of hers, the one that had held steady through 30 years of arena smoke and applause and the occasional bullet fragment, was holding now, though it cost her more than it ever had before. The auctioneer was a man named Harlan Croft, hired out of Greenville by the Darke County Agricultural Lending Authority, and he was doing his job with the brisk efficiency of a man who had done it many times that autumn. He had a clipboard. He had a deputy from the county sheriff's office standing at a respectful distance behind him. He had 3 buyers from the Pequa Processing Cooperative who had driven up before dawn to be first in line, and they stood now in a loose cluster near the barn with their hands in their coat pockets and their eyes on the cattle. Annie did not watch the buyers. She watched the cattle. 11 Hereford cows. She had raised most of them from calves born on this land, on land she and Frank Butler had bought in 1913, when they came back from their years with Buffalo Bill's outfit and decided that Ohio was where they would spend whatever was left of their lives. The herd had been larger once, 43 head at its peak in 1924, before the prices started their long, grinding collapse. She had sold a dozen in 1927 to cover a property tax shortfall. She had sold 14 more in 1929, when the note on the East pasture came due, and the bank would not extend it. These 11 were what remained, and by 10 o'clock that morning, for a combined sum of $218, they belonged to the Pequa Cooperative and would be loaded into a truck and driven away. That was how the autumn of 1931 came to Darke County, Ohio, and to one woman in particular who had spent the better part of her life being extraordinary and was now facing the very ordinary catastrophe of not having enough money to hold on to the ground beneath her feet. The Great Depression had reached Darke County the way it reached most agricultural counties in the Midwest, not as a single blow but as a series of compressions, each one smaller than the last and each one taking something that could not be replaced. The county had 17,000 residents in 1930. It had a regional economy built on grain, cattle, and the light manufacturing in the county seat of Greenville that supplied the farms. By the fall of 1931, the Greenville implement dealer had closed. The county's largest grain elevator had cut its purchase prices 3 times in 18 months. The Darke County National Bank had foreclosed on 41 farm properties since January, and there were 63 more loans in what the bank's officers called, in their internal correspondence, a condition of elevated concern. The land itself was unchanged. The Miami River bottomland was as black and loamy as it had been when the first settlers came through in the 1790s. The fields were flat and generous, and they had always produced. But what the fields produced, and what the market would pay for it, had come apart in a way that made the fertility of the land feel almost cruel. It kept giving, and what it gave was worth less with each passing season. Annie Oakley, the name she had performed under for 40 years, the name that had appeared on posters across 2 continents, the name that most people in Darke County still used for her out of affection and habit, and because Phoebe Ann Butler, which was her legal name since her marriage, had never quite fit the scale of who she was. Annie Oakley watched the last of her cattle loaded into the Pequa Cooperative's truck, and then she walked back to the farmhouse and sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the $218 in her hand. The note on the farmhouse and its 40 acres was held by the Darke County National Bank. The outstanding balance was $435. The bank had sent its second formal notice in September, and the language of that notice had been precise. Payment in full was required by December 1st, or the property would enter foreclosure proceedings. It was now the 12th of November. She had 19 days and $218 and no more cattle to sell. She was not a woman who panicked. She sat at the table and she looked at the number and she thought, with the methodical calm of someone who had spent decades making difficult shots, about what options remained. Phoebe Ann Mosey had been born on a farm not 12 miles from where she now sat, in August of 1860, the fifth of Susan and Jacob Mosey's 7 children. Her father had died when she was 6, leaving a family with no income and a farm that could not sustain itself with a widow and young children as its only labor. She had known poverty with the intimacy that only early childhood poverty produces, not as a social condition but as a physical one, as the specific sensation of cold and hunger, and the particular weight of a family that depends on you before you are old enough to understand what dependence means. She had learned to shoot out of necessity, not ambition. The farm needed meat. The family needed the money that came from selling game to hotels and restaurants in the county. She was 8 years old when she first took her father's Kentucky rifle into the fields north of the farmhouse, and she was 9 when she realized she was better with it than anyone she had ever seen. Not better in the way that children imagine themselves to be better at things, better in the measurable, undeniable sense that she almost never missed, and that the game she brought back was always shot cleanly, through the head, undamaging the meat, because she had figured out early that a clean shot meant more money per pound. She had hunted through her childhood and into her adolescence, selling to Katzenberger Brothers Grocery in Greenville, paying off the mortgage on her mother's farm with the proceeds, a debt of $200 that she cleared by the time she was 15, earning it 25 cents at a time through 1,000 precise moments in 1,000 cold fields. That original clarity of purpose, skill as survival, precision as provision, had never left her. It was the foundation on which everything else was built. She was 20 years old when she met Frank Butler in Cincinnati in 1880, a professional marksman from Ireland who had come to Ohio on a touring engagement. A local hotel owner named Jack Frost had arranged a shooting match between Butler and a local marksman, intending it as a promotional event. The local marksman had taken ill, or been unable to make the date, or, some versions of the story said, had heard enough about the young woman from Dark County to think twice. Whatever the reason, Annie Mosey had taken his place. She beat Frank Butler 25 birds to 24. He proposed 8 months later. They were married in Windsor, Ontario in August of 1882, and within 2 years she was performing alongside him in his act, and within 2 more years she was the headliner, and he was her manager, and he made this transition without apparent difficulty or resentment, because Frank Butler was, among his other qualities, a man who understood what he was looking at. She had spent 18 years with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, from 1885 to 1902, performing before audiences on 2 continents, shooting cigarettes from Frank's lips and dimes from between his fingers, and targets thrown into the air by men she had never met, who trusted that she would not miss. She had performed before Queen Victoria. She had performed before the Kaiser. She had performed in Madison Square Garden and in fields outside London and in arenas across France and Germany and Spain. She had been called Little Sure Shot by Sitting Bull, who had met her in 1884 and given her that name with the gravity of a man who chose his words carefully. She had earned more in a single season with the Wild West show than most Dark County families earned in a decade, and she had saved carefully, because she remembered what it felt like when there was nothing saved. And still, here was the table. Here were the $218. Here was the note for $435, and 19 days left on the clock. Frank had died in November of 1926, 18 days after Annie herself had suffered what the doctors called a significant decline. Her health had been failing since a serious automobile accident in 1922 that had partially paralyzed her legs, and from which she had, through the same combination of will and precision that defined everything she did, largely recovered. Frank had outlived her public life, but not by much. He died at 67, and she died 3 weeks later at 66, and the Greenville newspapers printed tributes that spoke of her life and legacy and the extraordinary thing she had been. And yet here she sat, not dead at all, in November of 1931, at 71, because the record had that wrong by at least a few years. The woman at the table was not the legend in the newspaper archives. She was the specific, living person who had outlasted several newspaper predictions about her health, and who was now looking at $218 and thinking about $435. The farm itself told the story of her years on it plainly enough. The house was a good farmhouse, 2 stories, white clapboard, with a kitchen that she had rebuilt in 1921 after a chimney fire, and a parlor that still held the display case of medals and trophies that Frank had kept polished, and that she had kept polished after him. The east pasture was 40 acres of good bottomland. The barn was solid. The well had never gone dry. There was a vegetable garden that she kept producing through the season with the same focus she had once brought to competitive shooting, methodically, precisely, without wasted effort. She had been living on what the garden produced and what she could bring in from the occasional appearance at county events and from the small investment income that remained from her better years, which had shrunk with everything else since 1929. She was not destitute. She was close to it. There was a distinction, and she was aware of it, and she suspected it would not survive December 1st. She had tried the bank first, in early October, because that was the logical first door. She had gone to the Darke County National Bank on Broadway in Greenville and asked to speak with the loan officer assigned to her account, a man named Gerald Thice, who had been with the bank since 1918, and who greeted her with the particular combination of courtesy and condescension that she had learned to recognize over the years as the posture of men who have power over a situation and know it. She had asked for an extension, Thice had explained, with the gentle firmness of a man who has explained the same thing many times, that the bank's policy regarding agricultural properties in arrears was clear and consistent, and had been established by the board of directors in response to the conditions of the current economic environment. Extensions were not being granted. The bank was, he said, committed to working with borrowers in difficulty, and what that commitment looked like in practice was a structured foreclosure process with a 90-day redemption window, during which the borrower could repay the full note balance, plus fees, and recover the property. The fees, he added, would be 8% of the outstanding balance. She had asked whether the board of directors might make an exception given her specific circumstances. Thice had asked her, with the same gentle firmness, whether she had documentation of those circumstances. She had brought with her the cattle records, the account books, the records of every sale she had made since 1927, the evidence of every reduction in her herd, and every dollar of income lost. He had looked at these documents with the expression of a man reviewing something that confirms rather than complicates his existing view of the situation, and he had told her that the documentation was thorough and that it would be noted in her file, and that the bank's position remained unchanged. She had left and gone to the County Agricultural Extension Office, which had a federal representative present on Tuesdays, a young man from Columbus named Dennis Aldrich, who was charged with helping farm families access whatever federal programs existed for their relief. Aldrich had been courteous and clearly exhausted from explaining the same limitations to the same kinds of people for months on end. The federal programs available to her were designed for operating farms with active income. She did not qualify for the livestock support program because her herd was below the minimum threshold. She did not qualify for the crop support program because her acreage was underproducing. She qualified for a small emergency loan program administered through the Farm Credit Administration, but the maximum loan under that program was $150. The application process took 6 to 8 weeks, and December 1st was 19 days away. She had tried a third door. She had written to a former colleague from the Wild West show years, a man named Johnny Baker who had performed alongside her for a decade and who had become, in retirement, a successful businessman in Denver. She had written with careful restraint, not asking for a gift but for a short-term loan of $217, the difference between what she had and what she needed, to be repaid with interest at whatever rate he found reasonable. The letter had been sent 3 weeks ago. She had received no reply. She did not know if the letter had reached him. She did not know if his circumstances had changed. She did not know much, sitting at the table on the 12th of November, except that she had $218 and a deadline, and the 3 doors she had tried had not opened. The man at the Greenville Hardware Supply on West 4th Street that November was not from Ohio. He had arrived in town the previous Friday in a dark blue Ford truck that had seen significant mileage and was carrying, in the truck bed, a modest amount of equipment that suggested a man who traveled with his necessities and not much more. He had taken a room at the Greenville Hotel on Broadway, paid a week in advance without negotiating the rate, and had spent the better part of 5 days being quietly present in a town that was trying, like most small towns in 1931, to keep its daily life intact against considerable pressure. His name was John Wayne. He was 24 years old, which in later years would seem impossibly young for the weight of the man. But in 1931 he was a young man from Iowa, by way of California, built wide and tall in the way that makes other men unconsciously give ground, with a deliberate way of moving and a habit of watching a room before he entered it that was not wariness so much as a kind of careful attention to the facts of a situation. He had grown up on an Iowa farm before his family moved west, and he understood what farm country looked like when it was in trouble. And Darke County in November of 1931 was farm country in trouble. He had come to Greenville on business that was, by his account to anyone who asked, a matter of looking at properties in the region. He was working at this time in the motion picture business in California. He had appeared in several films, including The Big Trail in 1930, which had not performed as well as its studio hoped, and had left him in the working actor category rather than the star category he had briefly seemed to be approaching. And he had some money, not a great deal but more than most people in Darke County had in November of 1931, and he had an instinct for land that came from his Iowa boyhood, and that he had never entirely set aside, even as he moved further into the world of cameras and sets and studio politics. He was also, in ways that had not yet become fully evident to him or to anyone else, the kind of man whose fundamental nature expressed itself most clearly in situations where someone who deserved better was getting something worse. He could not have articulated this about himself. He would not have tried, but it was there, as basic as his height and his voice and the way he could not quite pass a thing that was wrong without his feet slowing down. He had been in Kinane's Diner on South Broadway on the morning of the 11th of November when he overheard a conversation between 2 farmers at the adjacent table. They were talking about the auction at the Butler property the following morning, not with the pleasure that gossip sometimes contains, but with the subdued, careful sorrow of men who recognize a situation that could be their own. One of them had mentioned her name, not Annie Oakley. That name had a different weight, a public, historical weight, but Frank Butler's widow, the woman who'd been with the Wild West show, the woman who'd grown up over in North Star Township and come back to the county when she and Frank retired. John Wayne had eaten his breakfast and left the diner and spent the rest of the 11th of November asking careful, unhurried questions of the kind of people who know a town's true condition. The hardware store owner, the woman at the post office counter, the man at the implement dealer's that used to be a full operation and was now a parts and service shop, He learned the amount of the note. He learned the name of the bank officer. He learned that the auction had been scheduled by Harlan Croft of Greenville, and that the cattle were the last asset of any significant liquid value on the property. He did not say much during any of these conversations. He listened, asked a follow-up question when he needed clarification, and moved on. By early evening, he knew what he needed to know. He stood at the fence line of the Butler property on the morning of the 12th, about 60 yards east of where Annie Oakley was standing, and he watched the auction with his hands in his coat pockets and his hat pulled down against the wind. He did not identify himself to anyone present. He was just another man in a coat watching the proceedings with the neutral expression of a man who has no stake in them. He watched Annie Oakley stand at the fence and not flinch. That was the thing. He had expected, not weakness exactly, but some visible sign of the weight she was carrying. He had expected the posture of someone losing something. What he saw instead was a woman standing perfectly still in a good wool coat, watching the cattle go with the composed attention of someone who has already absorbed the loss and is now simply present for the fact of it. There was a quality to her stillness that he recognized from the very best people he had ever known, a stillness that was not absence but extreme, controlled presence. He stood at that fence for 45 minutes. He did not need 45 minutes to decide. He had probably decided the night before, sitting in his hotel room with a piece of paper and the numbers he had gathered. But he stood there anyway, watching the truck pull out of the yard with the 11 Hereford cows, watching Annie Oakley turn and walk back to the farmhouse, without hurrying, without looking back. Nobody in that room moved when she left. The buyers had their cattle. Harlan Croft was filling in his clipboard. The deputy had already gotten back in his car. The yard was empty, and then it was emptier, and John Wayne turned and walked back toward town. He was at the Darke County National Bank by 11 o'clock. He asked for Gerald Theis by name. The teller, a young woman named Margaret Howell who had been at the bank since 1929, and who recognized in John Wayne's quiet presentation the look of a man with a specific purpose, took him through to Theis's office without the usual preliminary of asking the nature of the visit. John Wayne settled into the chair across from the loan officer's desk with the unhurried ease of a man who had all the time there was. Theis was a compact, careful man of 50 or so, wearing a dark suit that had been pressed that morning, and carrying the muted demeanor of a bank officer in a depression year who was aware that his institution's decisions were not universally admired. He looked at John Wayne with professional courtesy and asked how he could help. John Wayne told him he wanted to pay off a note. Theis said that was something the bank was certainly able to accommodate, and asked which account he was referring to. John Wayne said the Butler property on County Road 4, north of the Greenville city limits. Outstanding balance of $435, plus any accrued fees. Theis was quiet for a moment. Then he said that the account holder would need to be present for such a transaction, or would need to provide written authorization. John Wayne said he understood that. He said he was not there to pay the account in Annie Butler's name. He was there to purchase the note from the bank directly, at full face value plus fees, which would settle the outstanding obligation and retire the mortgage entirely, and that the bank could record the transaction however it saw fit, so long as the property came out of it clear. Theis looked at him for a moment longer than was professionally comfortable. Then he asked John Wayne his name. John Wayne told him. Theis was quiet again. He was the kind of man who kept his reactions internal, but something in his expression shifted slightly in the way that things shift when a fact changes the dimensions of a situation. He pulled the Butler file from the cabinet behind his desk. He reviewed it on the desk in front of him for approximately 90 seconds without speaking. Then he said that the outstanding balance, including fees, calculated to $458.70. John Wayne said that was fine. He reached into his coat and produced a wallet that was unremarkable in every respect. Brown leather, worn at the corners, and from it he counted out the money onto the surface of Gerald Theis's desk, with the same deliberate, unhurried attention he brought to everything else. He counted $400 in 20s, and then he counted the remaining amount in smaller denominations, and he counted a second time after the first, because he was a precise man, and this was a transaction that needed to be exact. The bills lay on the desk in a neat stack, $458.70. Nobody in that office moved for a moment. Theis looked at the money. He looked at John Wayne. He looked back at the money with the expression of a man performing a rapid internal calculation about what was correct procedure in a situation that the bank's policies had not specifically anticipated. Then he reached for his ledger. The transaction took 40 minutes to complete. Theis had Margaret Howell come in from the front to serve as witness. He had the bank's attorney, a man named Carl Weston, who kept an office in the building 2 doors east on Broadway, called in to review the paperwork. Weston arrived in 11 minutes, read through the transaction documents with the thoroughness of a man who charges by the hour, and found the structure of it clean. The bank was receiving full payment on a delinquent note. The mortgage was being satisfied. The property would be released from encumbrance. The only question was the form of the release document, and Weston drafted it in 20 minutes at the bank's typewriter. A clean satisfaction of mortgage that extinguished the debt and released the property in fee simple. John Wayne signed as the paying party. Theis signed as the bank's representative. Weston signed as witness. Margaret Howell signed as a second witness. The bank's stamp went on at the bottom, and the date, November 12, 1931, was typed in the space provided. The copy of the satisfaction of mortgage was then folded carefully and placed in a plain white envelope. Theis, following the instruction he had been given at the start of the transaction, wrote on the envelope in his careful bank officer's hand, "Mrs. Frank Butler, County Road 4. He paid the full amount. He paid more than the full amount. The fees that had accrued brought the total above what the note itself required, and he paid those too without discussion." John Wayne picked up his copy of the transaction receipt, folded it into his wallet, nodded to Gerald Theis and Carl Weston and Margaret Howell in turn, and walked out of the dark County National Bank into the overcast November morning on Broadway in Greenville, Ohio. He drove his Ford truck out County Road 4. He pulled into the driveway of the Butler property at noon. The yard was quiet. The barn doors were open. The truck from the Pequa Cooperative was long gone. He parked and walked to the front door and knocked. Annie Oakley opened the door after a moment. She had changed out of the green wool coat and was wearing a plain house dress and an apron, and she was holding a dish towel, which told him she had been in the kitchen, which meant she had gone directly from the auction to the kitchen to do something practical, and this told him something he had already suspected about her character. She looked at him without recognition and without suspicion, just the clear, appraising attention of a woman who opens her own door and looks at who is standing on the other side of it. He took off his hat. He said his name. She knew it, not personally, but by reputation, the way people in 1931 knew the names of young actors who had appeared in widely discussed pictures. Her expression did not change in the way that expressions sometimes change at celebrity, with that small brightening of performance. She just waited to hear what he had come to say. He held out the envelope. He said that it was from the Dark County National Bank, and that it was addressed to her, and that she should read it, and that was all he said. She took the envelope and opened it and read the satisfaction of mortgage document in its entirety, which took about 90 seconds because she was a careful reader, and this was something that deserved to be read carefully. He watched her face while she read, and what he saw there was not the progression of emotions he might have expected, not relief cresting into gratitude, cresting into wonder. It was something more controlled and more complete than that. Her face was very still while she read, and when she finished she looked up at him with those gray eyes that did not miss much, and had probably never missed much, and she was quiet for a moment. She did not understand immediately what had just happened. Not the mechanics of it, those were plain enough in the document. What she did not immediately understand was the why, or what this man standing on her porch expected in return, and she was a woman who had spent enough time in the world to know that favors of this size rarely came without an expectation attached to them. She asked him directly what he wanted for it. He looked at her for a moment, then he said nothing. The silence lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. He said, "Nothing from you, ma'am. The bank has the money. The property is yours. Clear." She said she needed to understand the nature of the transaction, because she did not accept gifts from strangers, and she was not going to start. He said it was not a gift. He said he had purchased a delinquent note from a bank at face value, which was a legal transaction that required nothing from her, and that the property was free and clear of the encumbrance, and she should have a lawyer in Greenville record the satisfaction of mortgage at the county courthouse to make it official. She looked at him with the level attention she had once trained on targets 100 feet away. She was determining something. He could see her determining it. She said, "You don't know me." He said, "No, ma'am." She said, "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the unhurried way he said everything, that there was some land a man ought not to watch get taken, and that was all he said about it. She looked at the document again. She looked at the envelope with her name on it in Theus's careful handwriting. She was working through the implications with the methodical precision that was, in her, as natural as breathing. Her neighbors, the Callahan family from the farm to the east, had come down County Road 4 sometime during this exchange, their truck slowing as it passed the Butler driveway and then stopping when the driver, James Callahan, recognized John Wayne's Ford truck and the two figures on the porch. Callahan had been a farmer in Darke County since 1912, and he knew the Butler property's situation as well as any neighbor would, which was very well indeed. He sat in the idling truck at the end of the driveway for a moment, his wife Helen beside him, and then he drove on. He would tell people in the diner that afternoon what he had seen. A tall man in a coat standing on Annie Butler's porch, and Annie Butler standing in the doorway reading a piece of paper with the focus she had always brought to everything, and a quality to the air between those two figures that he could only describe as a thing that had just been settled. Inside the house, Annie Oakley set the document on the kitchen table, on top of the $218 that was still lying there from the morning. She looked at the document and the money together for a moment. Then she turned back to the door. He was already going down the porch steps. He had put his hat back on. She said his name. He stopped on the second step from the bottom and looked back at her. She said, "I would like to repay this. I intend to repay this. I want you to know that." He looked at her steadily. He said, "Yes, ma'am, I know you do." He went to his truck. She stood in the doorway and watched him back out of the drive and turn north on County Road 4, and she watched until the truck was gone around the bend, and then she stood there for another moment in the November cold before she went back inside. She did not repay it. Not because she would not have. She would have, every cent, with the same precision she had brought to every other debt she had ever carried, but because she died in November of 1926, the record said. And the record was partially right in the way that all records are partially right, which is to say it captured the fact without quite capturing the whole shape of the life. She lived another 4 years after the morning on the porch. 4 years of the farm, of the kitchen garden, of the east pasture under its 40 acres of sky. She tried twice more to reach John Wayne through letters sent to a California address she had obtained through a Greenville woman who followed the pictures, and there is no record that either letter reached him or that he received them. But he knew, in the way that some things are simply known, that the land had held. The week after the transaction at the bank, John Wayne had made one additional stop before leaving Greenville. He had gone to the office of Harry Simmons, who kept a law practice at the corner of Broadway and Fifth, and who was known as the kind of attorney who could be trusted to handle a matter quietly. He had given Simmons a letter, sealed, addressed to Annie Butler, and he had given Simmons a fee of $10 to hold it for 6 months, and then deliver it if she had not been in contact. The letter, Simmons later said to the woman at the Greenville Journal who asked about it years afterward, was brief. It said only that if she ever found herself in similar difficulty, she should contact a particular address in California, and that the offer would stand. She never contacted the address, but she never needed to. That was the last time anyone in Darke County saw John Wayne for some years. He drove his blue Ford truck out of Greenville on the afternoon of November 12, 1931, turned west on the National Road, and went back to his life in California and the career that would, in the decade that followed, take him far beyond the working actor category he occupied that autumn, into something larger and more durable than most careers in any field reach. He did not tell anyone about the transaction at the bank. He did not mention it in interviews. Gerald Theis did not discuss it with his customers. He was a discreet man by professional formation, and this transaction, unusual as it was, went into the bank's records and no further. Margaret Howell, the teller who had witnessed the signing, mentioned it once to her sister and then, understanding that some things are diminished by repetition, did not mention it again. The Callahans knew, or suspected. James Callahan told his wife Helen that evening that something had changed at the Butler place, and Helen, who had been following the situation with the focused attention of a neighbor who cares, had driven over the next morning and found Annie Butler in the kitchen garden, pulling the last of the late-season kale, and had asked her directly how things stood. Annie had handed her a bunch of kale. She had said that the property was clear. Helen Callahan had looked at her for a moment. She had said, "The tall man." Annie had said nothing. She had gone back to the garden. Helen Callahan drove home and told her husband that the tall man had done it, and James Callahan had looked out the window at the November fields for a moment, and then said that he was glad, and that was the extent of the commentary in the Callahan household on the matter. The winter of 1931 to 1932 was hard in Darke County, as it was across the Midwest, but it was harder for the people who spent it in the condition Annie Oakley no longer occupied, that particular suspended terror of the person who does not know if they will have a place to sleep by spring. She spent that winter in the farmhouse on County Road 4, in the kitchen she had rebuilt in 1921, with the satisfaction of mortgage document in the display case in the parlor, alongside the medals from London and the trophies from the arena seasons, and a photograph of her and Frank taken outside the Wild West show's tent in 1894, in which they are both smiling at something the camera cannot see. She spent that winter making plans. She had $218 and no cattle. What she had, in addition to the cleared land, was 40 years of accumulated reputation that had not entirely dissipated in the years since she left the show. She had a name, the name she had performed under, Annie Oakley, which still meant something in the world of 1932 in the way that certain names from certain eras of American life persist in the public consciousness well past their original context. She had her skills, which age had reduced but not erased. She was 71 years old and she could still shoot well enough to embarrass most people, and she had been teaching shooting to young women for years, informally, as a natural extension of who she was and what she believed, that women capable of defending and providing for themselves were better off than women who were not. She wrote to the Darke County School Board in January of 1932. She proposed a practical skills program for young women at the county's secondary schools, a curriculum that would teach marksmanship, outdoor skills, and what she called in her letter, the foundational competencies of self-sufficiency. She offered to teach it herself, at a modest fee per session. and she included in her letter a brief account of her qualifications that managed to be entirely factual and still constituted one of the more remarkable teaching credentials any school board in Ohio had ever received. The school board responded in February. They said yes. She began teaching in March of 1932 in the gymnasium at Greenville High School on Schweitzer Street, and then in the spring she moved the sessions outside to the county fairgrounds on Schweitzer, where the sight lines were long enough for proper practice. She taught 12 girls that first spring. She taught 22 the following fall. She charged $1.25 per student per session, which was enough. With the garden and a small arrangement she made with the Callahans to run a limited number of their cattle on her east pasture in exchange for a portion of the proceeds, to keep the farm not just solvent but gradually, carefully productive. By the spring of 1933, a year and a half after the morning of the auction, the Butler property on County Road 4 was running 18 head of cattle, not her own, but the Callahans' overflow, managed under an agreement that James Callahan described to his neighbors as the best arrangement he had made since he first plowed the East Bottoms in 1913. The east pasture was back in productive use. The garden had expanded. The farmhouse, from the road, looked like what it was, a working property tended by a person who intended to stay. The teaching program was the thing, though, not for the income it provided, though that was real, but for what it built around her in the community, a visible, active usefulness that returned to her something that the years of declining health and declining herd had gradually taken. She was not the spectacle she had been in the arena years, which was fine and more than fine. She was something quieter and more durable, a woman who knew something important and was passing it along. Her students were not uniformly talented. Some of them were. The girl who struck her most forcefully in those first years was a 15-year-old from outside New Madison named Clara Hess, who had her father's old Springfield rifle and a steadiness of hand and eye that reminded Annie, uncomfortably and with pleasure, of herself at the same age. Clara Hess learned everything Annie could teach her in 2 seasons, and then asked what came next. And Annie told her that what came next was that she would have to find a teacher she had not already surpassed. And Clara Hess went on to win the Ohio State Ladies Rifle Championship in 1937 and again in 1939, and she mentioned Annie Oakley's name in both acceptance speeches. In the spring of 1933, James and Helen Callahan brought their younger son, a boy of 12 named Robert, to the Butler property to help with the fencing of the east pasture, and Robert Callahan spent 2 Saturdays working alongside Annie on the fence line, which she drove herself with a methodical efficiency that made him feel that the work was serious, which it was. He remembered, in an interview he gave to the Darke County Historical Society in 1978, the quality of her attention when she was working, the way she made each task complete before moving to the next, and the way she spoke to him not as a child, but as a person engaged in the same work, and the way she said, at the end of the second Saturday, that he had done good work and she meant it, and that this was something he thought about for the rest of his life when he was trying to do something well. The farm held. That was the thing that required saying plainly, after all the detail of it. The farm held. The 40 acres on County Road 4 remained in the possession of the person who had built something on it, who had earned it in the deepest sense of the word long before she ever met a bank officer or heard the word foreclosure, and who used the years that followed to build something further still. She died in Greenville, Ohio, in the autumn of 1935, at the age of 75. The date was disputed in various records, because her life had generated more documentation than most lives, and some of that documentation was inconsistent, as documentation of remarkable lives tends to be. She died at the farmhouse on County Road 4, in the house with the rebuilt chimney and the display case of medals, and she died as she had lived, specifically and without wasted motion. The funeral was attended by people from across Darke County, and by several former members of the Wild West show who had traveled distances to be there, and by 23 young women who had learned to shoot under her instruction, and by the Callahans, who sat in the second row and said nothing and didn't need to. The satisfaction of mortgage document from the Darke County National Bank, dated November 12, 1931, bearing the signatures of John Wayne as paying party, Gerald Thice as bank representative, Carl Weston as attorney, and Margaret Howell as witness, was found in the display case in the parlor, filed behind the photograph from 1894, when they cleared the house in the weeks after her death. It was placed with the estate's records, which went to a cousin who had helped manage the property in her final years, a woman named Ruth Mosey, who kept the document with the care that it deserved. The farm itself was sold in 1937, after 2 years in the estate, to a Darke County family named Granger who farmed it productively through the war years and beyond. The farmhouse stood until 1962, when a fire of unclear origin, the county fire marshal's report cited faulty wiring, took the second story and left the ground floor structurally compromised. The Grangers built a new house on the same foundation and farmed the land another 15 years. And when old Thomas Granger retired in 1977, he sold the East 40 to a developer who put in a subdivision and the remaining ground to a grain operation that still farms it as of the early years of this century. The display case went to the Darke County Historical Society in Greenville, along with a collection of medals, photographs, and correspondence. It arrived in several boxes and was cataloged in 1938 by a society volunteer named Edith Barr, who was careful and thorough and who placed each item in an acid-free folder with a typed identification card. The satisfaction of mortgage document was cataloged as item 47 in the Butler Estate collection, a single folded page, slightly worn at the crease, bearing the bank's stamp and the 4 signatures and the date. Edith Barr noted in her cataloging record that the name on the document as paying party was John Wayne, and that he was listed at a California address, and that the amount paid was $458.70, and that the document appeared to represent the full satisfaction of the mortgage on the Butler property, and that she did not know the story behind it, and had been unable to find a written account of the circumstances. She added a note in pencil at the bottom of the catalog card, "Inquire further." She never did, as far as the records show, but the document stayed in its acid-free folder in the collection at the Darke County Historical Society, and the Historical Society moved to a new building on Broadway in 1961, and the Butler collection moved with it, and item 47 moved with the collection. By 1978, when the Historical Society mounted a small exhibition on Annie Oakley in honor of the 52nd anniversary of her death, the date it used being the one that appeared in most of the reference materials, which was not quite right but was close enough for a small-town exhibition, the satisfaction of mortgage was included in a glass case near the entrance to the exhibition room. It was displayed beside the photograph from 1894. The 2 items facing each other across a few inches of air the way things face each other when they belong together. A docent named Patricia Weeks, who had been with the Historical Society since 1971, and who had read everything available about Annie Oakley, and a good deal about the Depression's effects on Darke County agriculture, prepared a small card for the satisfaction of mortgage that explained the context. The card was accurate in its account of the financial conditions of November 1931. It was careful in its language about the identity of the paying party. It said only that the mortgage had been satisfied in full by a third party on November 12, 1931, and that the third party's identity was documented in the historical record, and that the circumstances of the transaction were not fully known. Visitors to the exhibition in 1978 read the card. Some of them looked at the signature on the document and recognized the name. A few of them asked Patricia Weeks about it. She told them what she knew. which was what the document said and what the catalog card said. And she told them what she did not know, which was why. And she said that the why was the interesting part, and that the document didn't tell you the why, it only told you the what, and that sometimes the what was enough. Robert Callahan, who was 59 years old in 1978, came to the exhibition on a Saturday in October with his wife and his 2 adult daughters. He stood in front of the display case for a long time. His daughters asked him what he was looking at. He told them about the 2 Saturdays on the fence line in 1933, about the woman who made each task complete before moving to the next, and who spoke to him as a person engaged in the same work. He told them about what his parents had understood about that November in 1931, in the way that parents know things and children understand them only later. He told them that the tall man had done it, which was the phrase his mother had used, and that he had never forgotten her saying it, and that now here was the piece of paper that proved it. His daughters looked at the document in its acid-free folder behind the glass. One of them, the younger one whose name was Anne, named Robert Callahan, acknowledged when she asked, for reasons that were not entirely accidental, asked whether the man had ever come back to Ohio. Robert Callahan said he didn't know. He stood there a moment longer. The document was just a piece of paper. 4 signatures, a stamp, a date, an amount. $458.70. Not a large sum in the ordinary way of large sums, in 1931 or in 1978. But the paper in the glass case was what remained of a moment on a November morning when 40 acres of Ohio farmland and one woman's capacity to continue doing what she had always done, working it, building on it, teaching what she knew to people who needed to know it, had been held in the balance by the question of whether someone with the means and the inclination would intervene, and the answer had come in the form of a quiet man counting money onto a bank officer's desk, with the same unhurried attention he brought to everything else. There is no monument to this in Darke County. There is no plaque on County Road 4, where the subdivision now stands on the ground that was once the East Pasture. There is no named scholarship or designated program or public memorial. There is a document in an acid-free folder in a historical society on Broadway in Greenville, Ohio, and a catalog card with a pencil note at the bottom that says, "Inquire further," and the last field that Annie Oakley ever owned, which is now someone's lawn. Some things are kept not by being remembered but by having happened, which is its own kind of permanence. And the woman who stood at a fence line in November of 1931, in a good wool coat and watched without flinching, knew something about that, knew it the way she had always known the things that mattered, which was not through sentiment, but through the long discipline of attention, through a life spent understanding that precision is not a talent but a practice, and that what you hold on to is what you chose, every morning, to keep holding.